Welcome to this installment of my video series on special education staffing in San Francisco Unified School District. This edition explores how, with contract protections removed, the district went about dismantling the inclusion programs while it blended inclusion services into a resource specialist program. Here, Dr. Tom Green discusses the purpose of special education, particularly accelerating student performance.
The purpose of special education is to design highly effective, specialized programs that match the instructional needs of our students such that we are accelerating the rate of achievement. It is entirely possible to do this. And we have the knowledge. We know how children learn. We know how to teach them. Our responsibility is to reorganize our resources and restructure our procedures so that we can get a lot closer to accomplishing that.
The document here is available in the description of the video below. It describes the hiring of Dr. Blanco as Assistant Superintendent of Special Education, as well as the hiring of a budget analyst whose sole function was to support principals and administrators understand, utilize, and leverage their budgets for maximum special education efficiency. The budget analyst's role fails to address whether students in these more efficient systems would have success in meeting IEP goals. That is, whether they would accelerate their learning. The special education budget is largely a budget of staffing costs, so there are really only two ways to reduce the budget: increase the number of students on a caseload, or reduce the level of services provided to each student. Unfortunately, both would follow. Changes came incrementally, but there was a short calm before the storm. Dr. Elizabeth Blanco, the new Assistant Superintendent of Special Education, selected Stetson and Associates to help with the efficiency of inclusive practices. Stetson had worked in the area of inclusive practices since the early 1990s. Their approach was to help districts with compliance and efficiency, two things the district leadership were particularly concerned with after the state takeover. They were not a union-friendly organization. The first major shift took place between 2012 and 2015, when the special day classes were closed and students were moved to inclusion. The caseloads for teachers remained roughly the same. It was an even swap of 111 classes for 111 resource specialists. However, in practice, the inclusion caseloads were blended with the existing resource specialist caseloads. So for the special day class teacher, the caseload or class size went up, whereas for the resource specialist, it went down. But the extent of needs also shifted, going up for everyone because the diversity of needs on their caseload increased. Also, it is interesting to note that there was not a new position created called Inclusion Support Teacher. Instead, inclusion was, from the outset, tallied in the Resource Specialist program. So between 2011 and 2019, it appears at first glance that inclusive practices were implemented without a reduction in staff. But this is a superficial reading of the data, as I will explain in the next few slides. On its own, this step does not appear to have dismantled special education in any way. The changes between 2016 and 2018 did dismantle special education. In one summer, the number of paraeducators was cut from 2,659 to just 801. This was done in two ways. First, the contract had redefined class size and caseload ratios, and the students in general education were now counted as resource specialist program students instead of inclusion students who were formerly special day class students. So the ratio dropped from one paraeducator to 10 students to one paraeducator to 28 students, approximately 1/3. Second, the special education staff had resource specialists move paraeducation services, which were classified as a 900 service, into an accommodation, which was not considered a service. This technicality helped the argument that students were not receiving 50% plus of their special education instruction. This move seems to be a gross violation of Section 31.8.5. Unfortunately, the Special Education Committee at this time was headed by a general education teacher who had no understanding of special education provisions in the contract, so the move was not challenged. Institutional knowledge is the accumulated information and experience within an organization that enables consistent, effective practices and continuity in service. The elimination of 70% of the special education paraeducators meant the elimination of several years of institutional knowledge. It also meant services would need to be provided in dramatically different ways. But the cuts were not the only thing to impact institutional knowledge. Staff turnover was also a huge problem. Unfortunately, the union was unsuccessful at getting SpEd teacher turnover data between 2012 and 2015. Those would have been interesting numbers, given that those are the years that special day classes were closed and inclusive practices were first implemented system-wide. Before we discuss that trend, it's important to understand the severity of the employee turnover in this chart. This represents 25 to 35% turnover per year of all special education teachers. In 2018 to 2019, there were 466 special education teachers, but here we see 677 teachers hired in just 5 years. There are, of course, some long-term special education teachers in the district, but it is quite likely that 80% or more of the special education positions have been filled by teachers hired since 2015, and there are very few teachers who can remember the work of the Inclusion Task Force. Most teachers simply do not know the past. Note that the openings in special education are almost entirely in the mild to moderate programs, that is, in the inclusion programs that expanded between 2012 and 2013. So the turnover rate is closer to 50% in that category each year. 105 of 236 positions in the 2015 to 2016 school year, and 124 of 244 in the 2016 to 2017 school year, etc. There wasn't necessarily a teacher resistance to inclusion. There was, however, a resistance to inclusion services staffed at resource levels. And something happened that brought that fear into reality. Enrollment in SpEd services skyrocketed. Between 2011 and 2019, SpEd enrollment grew by 1,100 students. It's hard to know what happened. Certainly the district had been criticized for under-identification. This is not to be confused with the criticism of over-identification, which refers to the over-identification of African American students, or over-proportionality. This is under-identification, where, as a whole, you under-identify the number of students in the district. Only 11% of the student body qualified for special education services, compared to 15% nationally. Today, the number remains just above 13%. So perhaps the budget analysts believe that an increase in school psychologists or an increase of school psychologists' time on assessments would allow the district to increase special education enrollment. Certainly, if this meant providing services to students who needed them, it was a noble intention. But the increased enrollment was never met with an increase in staffing. The 1,100 students were simply absorbed onto resource specialist caseloads. Recall that there were 466 special education teachers in the district in the 2018-2019 school year. Of those, fewer than 251 were resource specialists. That meant a caseload increase of 5+ students per resource specialist. In other words, the caseloads that had averaged around 17 students now shot up to 22+ at the start of the year. Remember, the inclusion program was starting to look more and more like a resource specialist program. After all, allocations for a resource program have 22 to 24 students as the caseload average for the start of the year. At least that is best practices. So this was a neat trick by Stetson and the budget analyst. They had followed the union contract in terms of not reducing staff. Well, except for the layoff of a couple thousand paraeducators. And they had moved more students to inclusive practices. But they had still managed to increase the caseloads of special education teachers. Is there any wonder that there is so much frustration from teachers towards central office? In the next few slides, we'll talk about institutional knowledge. What do we mean by institutional knowledge? Here is an example. Many students require instruction academic or otherwise, by a skilled teacher or paraeducator. The IEP provides a means of securing that training. Here, Ann Halverson explains one purpose of the other supports and services section of the IEP.
That the supports for personnel means supports for personnel in order to implement this IEP. And that means you can write right in there, this aid we think needs for this AC system or this behavior plan, 2 weeks of this many hours of training before he or she comes in the classroom, or ongoing meetings to support da. Parents can ask for that. You can ask for it for yourself, for a teacher who is now coming into a program that's supporting kids with dyslexia, and that wasn't your background. That needs to go in the IEP because it is, and for the general educator as well. I need support and understanding of behavior plan, and then the team can say, well, we think it take this much time and this will be delivered.
But with turnover at 50% in the inclusion resource program, there are few people who know how to specify training for the paraeducator they work with, themselves, or general education teachers, or even other adult support on campus. Returning to our graphic, by 2019, there were fewer special day classes, 100 fewer, but they continued to have the caseloads of special day classes, as spelled out in the union contract. And the resource specialist program now looked like this. There was no effective cap of caseloads at the previous levels. Instead, the state limit of 28 took effect. By the end of the school year, resource specialists at several schools were reaching their caseload capacity of 28 students. I myself reached a caseload of 31 students one year, but because I was on probationary status, my colleagues remembered that I not raised the issue. Remember, 140, 150 new special education teachers per year meant that 300 and some were on probationary status each at any given time. The foundation of effective special education lies in the presence of skilled staff, providing the individualized support each student needs to thrive. Two factors now affected the presence of skilled staff. One, staffing ratios meant 2 adults to support 28 students. And 2, employee turnover meant that 80% of resource specialists lacked the institutional knowledge to effectively do their jobs, and there was often no one to turn to ask for help. Returning to the quote in our earlier videos, we see that the resource specialist now had a caseload 2 to 3 times that of the original intention of inclusive schools. The worst fears had come true. The budget analyst and Stetson had identified efficiencies, but students would suffer as a result. Their learning would no longer accelerate. And it wouldn't just be students with IEPs, it would be all students in the district. This is because students with IEPs were largely attending classes in general education classrooms. In summary, the swift move to inclusive practices ended up being a shift from special day classes to resource specialist programs. Heterogeneous caseloads, which should have been staffed at special day class levels, instead had a cap of 28. Next, whatever happened to the inclusion programs that had successfully operated at schools like Washington High School? We'll explore that in our next video.